The fold of the note against Jasmine's palm felt sharper than the edge of a steak knife. In the hushed opulence of Monarch Prime, the clink of a porcelain teacup sounded like a gunshot she was the only one hearing. Her breath was a shallow, regulated secret behind a mask of professional neutrality, while beneath her skin, the quiet bravery she'd cultivated over years of double shifts began to burn. The atmosphere at Monarch Prime didn't just change when Kang Dae-Shin entered. It curdled. It was a subtle chemical shift, as if the oxygen had been replaced by something heavier and more expensive. He moved with a predatory grace that made his tailored charcoal suit look less like fashion and more like armor. Every stitch was precise, every line sharp enough to draw blood, but it was the sliver of ink peeking above his collar, a dark, jagged tattoo tracing the column of his neck, that whispered the truth. It was a mark of violence hidden beneath a veneer of civilization. The staff operated in a choreographed fear, moving in wide, cautious arcs around Table 9, ensuring that no glass remained empty and no crumb dared to rest on the white linen in the presence of the sovereign. Wait, just a moment, please. We have a small goal of reaching 10,000 subscribers, and your support would truly mean a lot to us. If you're enjoying this story, please consider subscribing. Thank you for being here with us. The atmosphere at Monarch Prime didn't just change when Kang Dae-Shin entered. It curdled. It was a subtle chemical shift, as if the oxygen had been replaced by something heavier and more expensive. Jasmine watched from the shadows of the service station as the sovereign of Table 9 took his seat. He moved with a predatory grace that made his tailored charcoal suit look less like fashion and more like armor. Every stitch was precise, every line sharp enough to draw blood, but it was the sliver of ink peeking above his collar, a dark, jagged tattoo tracing the column of his neck, that whispered the truth. It was a mark of violence hidden beneath a veneer of civilization. The restaurant staff operated in a state of choreographed fear. The lead sommelier, a man who usually carried himself with aristocratic disdain, now approached Table 9 with a tremor in his hands that he couldn't quite mask. He presented the wine list as if it were a holy relic, his eyes never rising above Kang's silk tie. The other waiters moved in wide, cautious arcs around the corner booth, their footsteps silent on the plush carpet, their voices dropping into a hushed, instinctive deference. They didn't just serve him. They negotiated with his presence, ensuring that no glass remained empty for more than a second, and no crumb dared to rest on the white linen. Kang himself remained a study in absolute stillness. He sat upright, his shoulders squared with a dominant ease that reclaimed the space around him as his private territory. He was a man used to being watched, yet he seemed entirely unbothered by the scrutiny, his dark eyes fixed on the entrance with a calm, alert intensity. On his wrist, a platinum watch glinted under the amber chandelier, a timepiece that cost more than Jasmine's college tuition, ticking away seconds that felt increasingly fragile. Jasmine adjusted her black bow tie, her reflection in the polished mahogany of the station showing a face that was a mask of professional neutrality. Unlike the others, she didn't look away. She noted the way he never leaned back, the way his right hand rested flat on the table, fingers steady and ready. He was a creature of habit, ordering the same rare steak and the same dark tea, but tonight, the ceremony felt different. The air was thick with the humidity of a storm that hadn't broken yet. As she prepared to approach him, Jasmine felt the weight of the restaurant's collective anxiety. She was the only one allowed within his immediate orbit tonight, and as she stepped into the light of Table 9, she realized that the sovereign wasn't just dining, he was waiting. The Monarch Prime prided itself on a seamless experience, a place where the service was intended to be as invisible as the air. But to Jasmine, the room had begun to fray at the edges. While the other servers hovered nervously around the VIP booths, Jasmine's gaze drifted to the long, obsidian-topped bar. There was a glitch in the symphony. Two men sat at the far end, their backs to the room, framed by the amber glow of the backlit spirits. On the surface, they were unremarkable, dressed in dark blazers that fit a bit too loosely in the shoulders, suggesting a hidden weight beneath the fabric. They had ordered neat scotches 10 minutes ago, yet the level of the amber liquid hadn't moved. The condensation on their glasses had long since pooled into stagnant rings on the marble. They weren't there for the vintage malts or the curated atmosphere. Jasmine moved to the side station, ostensibly to polish a tray of crystal flutes, but her focus was elsewhere. In the massive, gold-leafed mirror behind the bar, she caught the angle of their vision. They weren't looking at the bartender or the rows of shimmering bottles. Their eyes were locked onto the silvered glass, tracking the reflection of Table 9. They were watching Kang Dae-Shin through a double layer of glass, orbiting him like silent, predatory satellites. One man reached for his breast pocket, his movement practiced and minimal, while the other checked a heavy diver's watch with a flick of his wrist. It was a gesture of synchronization, a silent calibration of timing that Jasmine recognized from her years of observing human behavior. The air around them didn't carry the relaxed hum of dinner conversation. It possessed the static charge of a lightning strike about to ground. A busboy hurried past them, nearly clipping the shoulder of the man on the left, but the stranger didn't flinch or turn. That lack of a startle reflex was the loudest alarm bell of all. It was the stillness of a hunter who is already committed to the kill. Jasmine's pulse thudded against the starch of her collar. She looked back at Kang, who was currently lifting a porcelain teacup to his lips. He was the center of an invisible crosshair, and the world was about to shatter around him. The clink of her polishing cloth against a glass sounded like a hammer in her ears. She knew the protocol. Tell the manager, call security, stay in your lane. But she had seen the manager's obsequious smile earlier. He was too blinded by Kang's status to see the wolves at the door. If she didn't move now, the white tablecloth at Table 9 would be stained with more than just spilled wine. Jasmine's fingers felt cold as she reached for the small, heavy square of paper she had slipped from her order pad. She didn't write it at the station. She had done it in the shadows of the linen closet, her pen digging into the paper with a desperate, silent force. Now, she moved toward Table 9, her walk a practiced, rhythmic glide that masked the frantic hammering of her heart against her ribs. To any observer, she was merely the diligent server attending to the sovereign's final course. But to her, every step felt like walking a tightrope over an abyss. Kang Dae-Shin did not look up as she approached. He was a statue carved from granite and expensive wool, his focus seemingly fixed on the steam rising from his untouched tea. The men at the bar shifted in the mirror's reflection, a lean forward, a hand sliding deeper into a jacket. The clock in Jasmine's head was screaming. She reached the table and leaned in, the movement graceful and deferential. "Your dessert menu, sir," she murmured, her voice steady despite the Arctic chill in her veins. She placed the leather-bound folder on the table, but as she did, her hand slid the small, folded note beneath the base of his thumb. For a heartbeat that felt like an eternity, their fingers brushed. It was a moment of silent lightning. The contact was electric, a jolt of raw, grounded energy that seemed to freeze the very air between them. His skin was warm, his hand unmoving, yet the physical connection pulled Jasmine entirely out of the restaurant's curated luxury and into the heart of his violent reality. She felt the calluses on his palm, the steadiness of a man who had never known a day without the threat of death. Kang's eyes flicked up. For the first time he looked at her, not as a fixture of the restaurant, but as a person. His gaze was dark, piercing, and terrifyingly intelligent. He didn't pull away. Instead, he maintained the contact for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, his thumb pinning the note against the table with a slow, deliberate pressure. It was an acknowledgement, a silent communion that bridged the gap between the waitress and the predator. Jasmine didn't blink. She met that gaze with her own quiet bravery, a wordless plea for him to believe her. She saw the moment he registered the weight of her seriousness. Without a word, he retracted his hand, the note disappearing into his palm with a magician's sleight of hand. He didn't look at the paper yet. He simply tapped the table once with his index finger, a confirmation of receipt. Jasmine straightened her back, her shoulders relaxed by sheer force of will. As she turned away to retreat toward the kitchen, she felt his eyes on her spine, a heavy, protective weight that told her the world had just changed. She had given him the gift of time. Now she had to pray he was fast enough to use it. Kang Dae-Shin did not rush. To flee would be to admit vulnerability, and a man like Kang never bled in public. He stood with the fluid, unhurried grace of a king ending an audience, smoothing the front of his charcoal jacket. He didn't look back at the bar, nor did he look at Jasmine, but the air around Table 9 had shifted from a simmer to a hard, cold boil. He moved toward the rear of the dining room, his silhouette melting into the dim, amber-lit shadows of the corridor leading to the kitchens. Jasmine watched him vanish, her hands gripping the edges of a serving tray until her knuckles turned a ghostly white. The civilized veneer of Monarch Prime began to crack the moment he was out of sight. At the bar, the two men rose in a single, synchronized motion, their scotches left abandoned and sweating on the marble. The practiced indifference they had worn like a mask fell away, replaced by a focused, lethal urgency. They didn't care about the bill. They didn't care about the decorum. They moved with a heavy, rhythmic tread that sounded like a drumbeat of war against the polished hardwood. "Service check on table 12, a fellow waiter chirped, oblivious to the impending collapse. The sound was jarring, a high-pitched note in a room that had suddenly gone silent. Jasmine's ears rang. She saw the men reach the kitchen threshold just as the heavy steel doors hissed shut behind them. Then came the sound, not a bang, but a mechanical, metallic groan. It was the service elevator, an old, industrial beast, grinding into motion. Kang was gone into the guts of the building. The restaurant's atmosphere, once thick with luxury, now felt suffocating and hollow. The jazz continued to play, a soft saxophone trill that felt like a mockery of the violence blooming just behind the swinging doors. A sudden, sharp crash erupted from the kitchen, the sound of shattering porcelain followed by a heavy, muffled thud that vibrated through the floorboards and into the soles of Jasmine's shoes. Customers began to look up from their plates, their faces twisting from contentment to confusion, then to a primal, unnamed fear. The choreography of fear among the staff broke into a chaotic scramble. The maitre d' dropped his seating chart, his face draining of color as he looked toward the kitchen doors. Jasmine stood rooted to her spot, a lone dark pillar in the middle of the shifting room. She could almost feel the shadows lengthening, the safety of her white tablecloth world dissolving into the gray, jagged reality of Kang. She had saved the sovereign, but as the lights flickered and the first panicked murmur rose from the crowd, she realized she was now left alone in the wreckage of the piece she had just destroyed. The transition from chaos back to silence happened with a clinical, terrifying speed. Within an hour, the pulsing blue lights of police cruisers had dimmed, and the Monarch Prime was purged of its patrons. No headlines followed, no news vans arrived. Instead, a fleet of black sedans with tinted windows replaced the emergency vehicles, and men in suits more expensive than the officers' uniforms took control of the perimeter. By midnight, a professionally printed sign was already taped to the heavy oak doors, closed for immediate renovations. Jasmine walked out the employee entrance into the humid Georgia night, her uniform jacket buttoned tight against a chill that wasn't in the air. The city of Savannah, usually a tapestry of romantic shadows and cobblestone charm, had been stripped of its beauty. To Jasmine, the streets now looked like a sprawling granite chessboard. Every alleyway was a potential move. Every parked car was a piece in a game she had only just learned was being played. Her footsteps echoed too loudly against the historic brick. She found herself counting the seconds between street lamps, her eyes no longer drifting to the moon over the river, but scanning the dark interiors of passing vehicles. She noted the hand positions of the man smoking a cigarette on his porch. She tracked the reflection of a slow-moving sedan in a shop window. The quiet bravery that had guided her through the note delivery had left a residue of hypervigilance that she couldn't wash off. The Spanish moss draped over the ancient oaks didn't look like lace anymore. It looked like heavy, gray shrouds. As she crossed Broughton Street, she felt the invisible lines of territory that her criminal psychology textbooks had only described in the abstract. She was a pawn that had moved to the end of the board and transformed, yet she didn't know what she had become. The weight of the evening, the brush of Kang's fingers, the metallic groan of the elevator, the muffled violence of the hit, sat in her stomach like lead. When she finally reached her apartment, the lock clicked with a finality that offered no comfort. She stood in the dark of her hallway, her back pressed against the wood, listening to the silence of her own home. For the first time in her life, the space felt too small, too predictable. She was no longer a ghost in a high-end restaurant. She was a marked coordinate. Somewhere in the city, Kang Dae-Shin was alive because of her, and in the underworld, life was a currency that always came with interest. She didn't turn on the lights. She simply sat on the floor, watching the shadows of the trees dance on her wall, waiting for the first move of the next game. The renovations at Monarch Prime were a masterclass in erasure. When Jasmine returned for her first mandatory staff meeting 3 days later, the scent of industrial-strength bleach and fresh floor wax was so thick it stung her throat. The restaurant looked untouched, the shattered porcelain and the muffled violence of the service elevator smoothed over by the invisible hands of Kang's influence. Her locker felt like a time capsule of a life she no longer fully recognized. When she pulled the latch, she expected only her spare apron and a worn textbook on behavioral patterns. Instead, resting atop her folded white shirt was a small, square box wrapped in black velvet. It sat there with a heavy, magnetic presence, looking entirely out of place against the dented metal of the locker. Jasmine's breath hitched. She checked over her shoulder. The locker room was a cathedral of echoing footsteps and the distant hum of the ventilation system, but she felt as though 1,000 eyes were focused on her spine. With trembling fingers, she lifted the lid. Under the harsh, flickering buzz of the overhead fluorescent lights, the object inside glowed with a soft, ancient warmth. It was a binieo, a traditional Korean hairpin, crafted from solid, high-carat gold. The head of the pin was shaped into a delicate, stylized crane, its wings unfurled in a gesture of protection. The craftsmanship was breathtaking, the gold so pure it seemed to drink the artificial light of the room and transform it into something sacred. But as Jasmine lifted it from its silk bed, she felt the true weight of the gift. It was cool and substantial against her palm, but it didn't feel like jewelry. It felt like a tether. To anyone else, it was a staggering tip for a job well done. To Jasmine, who had studied the symbolic hierarchies of power, it was a golden debt. In Kang's world, a life saved was a life owned. She turned the pin over, noticing a microscopic seam along the crane's body. This wasn't just an ornament. It was an instrument, likely housing a tracking beacon or a direct line to the man who now considered her an investment. By accepting it, she was moving from the periphery of the chessboard directly into the inner circle. The gold binieo was a beautiful, suffocating burden. It signaled to the rest of the world that she was under the wing of the sovereign, but it also meant that his enemies would now see her as his most vulnerable pressure point. Jasmine tucked the box into the deepest pocket of her vest, the metal pressing against her ribs like a silent, golden heartbeat. She tied her apron with a renewed, grim discipline. The waitress who had walked into the restaurant was gone. The one standing there now was a woman who knew that the most expensive gifts always come with a blood price. The invisibility of Jasmine's former life was being replaced by a presence so meticulous it was almost indistinguishable from coincidence. It began with the hallway. Her apartment building in the historic district was a drafty, charming relic where the light bulbs stayed dead for weeks, and the front door's latch was more a suggestion than a lock. But 3 days after the gold binieo arrived, the hallway was flooded with the clean, sterile glow of new LEDs. The door's hardware had been replaced with a heavy, dead-bolted electronic system that hummed with a low, expensive frequency. Then there was the new tenant in 3B. He was a man of medium build with a nondescript face and a wardrobe of ironed flannels, the kind of person your eyes naturally slid over. He claimed to work in logistics, but Jasmine noticed he never carried groceries, only small, encrypted-looking cases. He was always in the hall when she left for her shift, offering a polite, distant nod that held no warmth, only a terrifyingly focused observation. He didn't just live there, he positioned himself. He was a human barrier placed between her front door and the rest of the world. Outside, the chessboard had solidified. Every time Jasmine stepped onto the sidewalk, a silver taxi was idling at the corner, its meter off, its driver obscured by the glare on the windshield. It was never the same driver, but it was always the same car. It followed her at a discreet 2-block interval, a silent metallic shadow that matched her pace with predatory precision. When she reached the crowded squares of downtown, she would catch glimpses of men in the periphery. Men who didn't look like tourists or locals, but like logistics professionals, their gazes sweeping the rooftops and alleyways before she even approached them. The realization hit her during a morning run along the river. She had turned a corner too quickly and nearly collided with a man leaning against a lamppost. He didn't move to apologize. He simply stood his ground, his hand subtly drifting toward the small of his back, his eyes scanning the area behind her for threats. In that moment, Jasmine understood that her quiet bravery had stripped her of her anonymity. She was the center of a mobile fortress. She wasn't being stalked, she was being encased. Kang Dae-Shin was honoring his unbreakable debt by turning her world into a high-security ward. The Spanish moss no longer felt like a shroud, but like a curtain behind which an army waited. As she climbed the stairs to her apartment that evening, the ghost guard in 3B held the door open for her. She looked into his flat, unreadable eyes and realized that while she was the most protected woman in Savannah, she was also the most visible target on the board. The shield was also a cage. The Monarch Prime had been open for 2 hours when the Sovereign returned. The atmosphere didn't just dip, it flattened. The ambient noise of clinking silverware and low-frequency laughter vanished, replaced by an alert, breathless stillness. Kang Dae-Shin stepped into the light of the dining room, looking as though he had never left, though the ink on his neck seemed darker against the crisp white of a new silk shirt. He didn't wait to be seated. He moved directly to table 9, his presence pulling the choreography of fear back into its tight, anxious rhythm. Jasmine didn't hesitate. She took the gold binieo from her pocket, the crane's wings pressing into her palm, and approached with a tray of the dark tea he favored. As she set the cup down, the steam rising between them like a fragile veil, Kang looked up. His eyes were not cold, but they possessed a terrifying, microscopic focus. "You are wearing the gold in your pocket, not your hair," he said. His voice was a low, cultured baritone that carried the weight of an ultimatum. A wise choice for a woman who values discretion. Jasmine straightened her vest, her dark eyes meeting his. "It's a heavy gift, Mr. Kang, perhaps too heavy for a waitress." "You were never just a waitress, Jasmine Carter," he replied, and the sound of her full name on his lips sent a rhythmic chill through her chest. "Born in Atlanta, top of your class at Savannah State, currently writing a thesis on the psychological triggers of organizational loyalty. You live in apartment 4A, you prefer the river run because the wind masks the sound of your own breathing." The sheer volume of his knowledge was a violation disguised as protection. He had dismantled her privacy with the same precision he used to dismantle his enemies. He reached out, his long fingers hovering just inches from the tray. With a subtle flick of his nail, he pressed a hidden catch on the head of the gold crane. A tiny blue pulse of light flickered once deep within the gold before vanishing. "The binieo is not just an ornament," he murmured. "It is a silent frequency. If the seam is pressed for 3 seconds, the men you have noticed in your hallway and the car you see on your corner will enter whatever room you are in. They do not work for the city. They work for the debt I owe you." He leaned back, his posture dominant and relaxed. "I know your life because your life is now part of mine. The Cardosos do not forget the faces of those who ruin their plans. You can keep the pin, or you can throw it in the Savannah River, but the protection remains. The only question left is whether you will use the eyes God gave you to help me see what is coming next." The tea poured in a long, amber ribbon, the steam rising in a clean, fragrant cloud that carried no scent of bitterness or betrayal. Jasmine's hand was steady, not the practiced steadiness of a server performing for a tip, but the iron-willed composure of a woman who had looked into the abyss and decided she wasn't afraid of the heights. The fine porcelain cup sat before Kang Dae-Shin, a perfect circle of warmth on the white linen, untainted and honest. Kang watched the liquid settle, his dark eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight of the dining room. He didn't reach for the cup immediately. Instead, he watched Jasmine as she straightened, her black bow tie perfectly centered, her expression a mirror of his own unreadable calm. The choreography of fear that had once defined the restaurant felt distant now, a frantic dance performed by people who didn't understand the music. "Is it to your liking, Mr. Kang?" she asked. Her voice was low, carrying just enough resonance to bridge the space between them without alerting the surrounding tables. "It is exactly what I required," he replied. He took a slow, deliberate sip, acknowledging the trust she had offered him with a slight incline of his head. He set the cup back down with a precise click against the saucer. "The world is a noisy place, Jasmine. Most people hear the music, but they never listen to the rhythm. They see the players, but they miss the play." He gestured vaguely to the room around them. Monarch Prime was full tonight. To a casual observer, it was a scene of peak savannah luxury. City council members laughing over ribeye, tourists celebrating anniversaries, and old money families whispering over vintage Bordeaux. But the air was thick with the hidden variables she had learned to calculate. "Tell me," Kang murmured, leaning forward just enough to pull her back into his private orbit. "Use those eyes you trained at the university. Forget the menus. Forget the service. Tell me what you see in this room tonight." Jasmine didn't hesitate. She didn't need to look around. She had been cataloging the room since she clocked in. She allowed her gaze to sweep the floor with a detached, clinical precision, her mind acting as a filter for the normalcy that disguised the dangerous undercurrents. "Table 4, she began, her voice a soft staccato. "The couple's celebrating an anniversary. The man is checking the exit every 3 minutes, and his phone has buzzed 6 times without him looking at the screen. He's not celebrating, he's waiting for a signal. Table 12, the 3 men in the corner. They've ordered the most expensive bottles on the list, but they aren't drinking. They're leaning inward, their shoulders tight, blocking the view of the kitchen door. And the woman at the bar, the one in the red silk dress. What about her?" Kang asked, his interest sharpening. "She's left-handed, but her glass is on her right. Her left hand hasn't left her clutch bag since she sat down. She's not here for a drink. She's an observer, just like me. But she's looking at your security, not at you." A ghost of a smile touched Kang's lips, a rare, fleeting transformation that made him look less like a sovereign and more like a man who had finally found something worth keeping. He tapped his index finger against the table, the same signal of confirmation he had given when he first received her note. "Most people see a restaurant," he said softly. "You see a battlefield. You see the glitch in the service before the first shot is fired." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook, sliding it across the linen toward her. "The Binieo in your pocket is your shield. This is your ledger. From this moment on, you are no longer just a waitress at Monarch Prime. You are my eyes in the rooms I cannot enter. You will see what they miss. You will hear what they whisper." Jasmine looked at the notebook, then back at the man who had turned her life into a high-stakes game of strategy. She realized then that there was no going back to the girl who simply wanted to finish her degree and live a quiet life. That girl had died the moment she circled those words in blue ink. "And if I see something you don't want to hear?" she asked. "Especially then," Kang replied. Jasmine picked up the ledger, tucking it into the pocket of her black vest alongside the gold hairpin. She picked up the teapot, her posture upright and purposeful. She wasn't just a savior anymore. She was an asset, a partner in a silent war. As she moved toward the next table, her reflection in the gold-leafed mirrors showed a woman who walked with the cold, calculated grace of a queen. The new normal had begun, and for the first time, Jasmine Carter wasn't just surviving the game, she was playing it.